Hey again everyone, and welcome back to the channel for another installment in our new figure showcase series, where I give you guys a quick look at a figure I'm adding into the collection. More often than not, a recent release, but there are the occasional exceptions to that. But for today's installment, I'm actually really excited to get this figure out of the box after what was a long wait with extensive delays. And the figure we're going to be looking at is the Duke Leto Atreides from the Denis Villeneuve Dune Part 1, as portrayed by Oscar Isaac. Look, I'll be honest, we got Dune Part 2, and Inart jumped into the fray with their version of Paul Atreides from the first movie, and I actually went through a moment where I didn't think any of the AUG Toys figures would see the light of day, but after a tease from them that the figures were still coming, we finally got them in hand. Now, I personally love Dune Part 1. I also love the books, and seeing them brought to life the way that Denis Villeneuve did was just incredible to me. And I thought Oscar Isaac captured that nobility of Duke Leto amazingly well. So his death and the betrayal of the Atreides family really hit hard, especially when you realize Duke Leto and his senior staff were well aware of what they were walking into, and they realized that the Emperor had nefarious plans for them, which is why he wanted to cultivate desert power. Unfortunately, time was not on their side. So obviously I'm a huge fan. So AUG Toys initially released the Paul Atreides in ceremonial uniform, which was a decent first figure, and then they announced Duke Leto, Gurney, and a second version of Paul in the still suit. They also teased the Duncan Idaho, but I just don't know what the future really holds for this line, if any. But for now, excited to at least have these in hand. So let's look at what's included in this version. And first thing you'll notice is that there's not much to the figure. You get the figure itself, then some spare hands, his small sword, as well as a very sleek but minimalist sheath for it, and the fancy binoculars. And then you get a base that's almost a little diorama kind of looking base, which, similar to the original release, is a slight environmentally themed one. And that's about it, although I think for this particular release it's pretty much more than enough. So let's jump into the accessories and start off with the hands, as is our norm. So look, they're pretty well done, although gloved hands don't require as much detail, but there are some nice elements here. In particular, the armored plates over the back of the hand that cover the upper portion of the fingers. Some of the gloves do also include some slightly more intricate stitch detailing on the sculpt, but that's not consistent from hand to hand. Overall, though, they look good. My only immediate gripe with these, they are a very hard plastic, with very minimal flex to them. So getting the accessories into position on the hands, I can tell you already, is going to be a bit of a challenge. And also replacing pegs, it's going to require a heat gun or the old hot water trick. Now, I normally don't do this before we jump into the small sword, but I did want to show a still from the movie from Duke Leto's kit, namely drawing attention to the sword handle and to the connector holding the sword in place, which is imprinted with the House Atreides logo. And I'm doing that because you can tell how some shortcuts were taken for the figure, especially when we look at the gurney later on. But the handle's wrong. It doesn't have that crisscross lace work on the grip, and the sheath is missing that symbol. Look, what we saw on screen, we saw for maybe a few seconds, so it's not a deal breaker at all, but definitely an inaccuracy to the character that I noticed. The rest of the sword, though, can't complain. Handle does include a grip with nice texturing, while the blade has a very clean look to it with the sharp edge. Holder's very minimalist again, which is interesting, and it was an interesting design choice for the movie, but overall solid. Then you get the binoculars, which he uses again early on in the movie as he surveys over the city, as his staff points out different elements that he should be aware of. So very scene specific as well, but it's well done. The body of the binoculars is well detailed with some great metallic paint apps, but the real shining star here are the lenses. I'm not sure if this is just a clear epoxy that was used to create them, but there's a very real feel to them. So I have to give credit to AUG Toys here for doing something pretty neat with these. And next up is the base. So let's start with the size, and you'll see the figure on this a little bit later, but it's the same type we got with the original Paul a while back. Same dimensions, and look, while I like the nameplate being on a metal piece and actually being engraved, it's a large base taking up a lot of real estate. Even vertically, there's a lot of excess material. So that's a bit of an issue if space is a concern. The other thing you're getting here is a themed surface, which is meant to represent the surface of Dune. It's a desert, but it just brings to mind, when I look at these, the dreaded Star Wars Hot Toys bases that had the sand surface with the footprints that they were using over and over. So this is very similar. I get it for Dune, 100%, but not sure about this one. But again, could they have done something different? I don't know. I think it's decent for what we're getting. But now let's jump into the sculpt. And look, there's one thing that bugs me here, and I'll start off the bat. One of the eyes looks a little wonky on mine. His right eye just seems a little bit droopy. Now, the sculpt itself has a really good likeness to Oscar Isaac. I think that it's pretty decent overall. The paint on the hair, the skin, actually is really good work. The beard and the hair do lack some of the detail we get from other companies like Hot Toys, but it's not as soft as some other releases we've looked at in the past. So definitely solid. And again, even the paint they used for the eyes has that slightly more realistic look to it, so it's not giving you that dead doll eye look. But I do think that that is the one issue with this sculpt, and it's the paint on the eyes isn't the best, and it's just a little off, and it's throwing the sculpt off for me, unfortunately. I do think, again, though, that overall it's a solid effort for a company's sophomore outing, and I do see the likeness to Duke Leto there. Now, the rest of the figure I think is really interesting. It has a ton of positives, but also some issues, so unfortunately not a total hit here either. But let's start with the look of the figure. The armor looks amazing. It's a great recreation of what we saw as House Atreides armor when they land on Dune and march across the field to their transports. And we see this later on in a few scenes. And as a slight aside, it's such an interesting blend of our kind of current technology, where you can almost see the evolution to a futuristic world. For example, the gray undersuit holding the armor in place looks like a modern-day army combat uniform. And the pants, while they do have some interesting tailoring that's a little different and unique, still have that built-in plate holder on the knees for the knee guards. Arms are also nice, loose fabric, but then you get that very interesting looking armor with the overly large shoulder plates, as well as the collar around the neck. Keeping in mind that this is a future where you do have personal shields and the primary method of fighting is using knives and swords, you would want the heavier protection around critical parts of your body. So it's a functional design that makes sense, and I think it's recreated decently here. There's some incorrect items. For example, the straps holding the armor together along the torso should be more of a leather material. Here we're getting fabric, but it's a good approximation on this scale of what we got in the movie. But again, some issues, and the main one is posability, especially the lower torso and legs. The armor does hang low, protecting the torso and upper legs, so getting the figure's legs to move, it's not the easiest. And while I did try to push a little bit, I could hear the armor starting to creak, so I eased off to avoid breaking anything. So that was a bit annoying to realize. Although in Dune Part 1, Leto basically walks, and in this particular bit of armor, it's not like we see him engaged in full combat. So thinking in those terms, a super dynamic pose isn't really something that you would expect him to be able to pull off. Now, the arms are another story, because you do get double jointed elbows, so there is definitely more flexibility here. So you'll see most of the poses taking advantage of that. But again, there is some hindrance of movement driven by the shoulder armor, which, again, they're massive. So the way that AUG Toys designed this is pretty decent, I do have to say, but I do worry about long-term issues. So there's an elastic band holding the armor down onto the arm. Given how high the armor extends, the band is already elongated in tension. So I was trying to just get the figure posed with, say, his hands clasped behind his back, and I thought I broke the armor when it snapped back into position. But that's when I discovered that there is a bit of Velcro as well on the arm that holds the armor in place. But unless his arms are directly at his sides, I noticed that the shoulder guards become detached when you're trying to pose it from that Velcro, and it does become visible, so just a little bit annoying. And hopefully, again, the bands don't lose that elasticity in the long run, given that the tension, that they're already under tension. Also, the armor around the neck does mean that you can't really get the head turned because it hits the beard. So you pretty much need to have him looking straight. And since it's hard plastic, you can't even try to force it or you're going to damage the sculpt, the armor, or both. So you can almost start seeing how this is a figure that's going to want to be in a slight museum pose, maybe with some minor arm poses. But even there's some issues worth discussing. And that namely has to do with the hands. So I kind of alluded to it earlier, but the hands are very hard plastic, not like the type we get with Hot Toys or X06. So swapping out the hands, you need a heat gun to get the pegs swapped out. Fortunately, AUG Toys does include some additionals, but the other issue, and I'm showing you the hand design for holding the sword, you can see that I already scraped the hand trying to get the sword in place, since there's no give to it. As soon as you try to get the sword pushed in, it's just not able to fit well. So I tried to force it a little bit and gave up immediately once I noticed the damage. In addition, the slot itself seems undersized, so that's another issue. And I would have wanted to see that resolved a little bit more easily. So that's why in most poses you're going to see him using the slightly relaxed hand, because I was able to use that to hold the sword in place. Just not ideal. So look, I'm happy to have him in hand. Overall, he looks really good. And that's a big part of the battle with these figures, right? It's aesthetics versus posability. but the posability is pretty limited. Again, not a figure that needs it based on what we saw in Dune Part 1, but it's an observation worth making. Maybe part of it was unavoidable just given the design of the armor, but then there are other just slight QC issues like the eye and the hands with the fit for the sword. To me, that's something that could have been addressed. So I do have another video set to look at Gurney, and then I'll do a wrap-up video looking at both, and I'll discuss the cost on that one. But I will tell you, as a big fan of Dune Part 1, which I know a lot of people thought was a really slow movie, but for myself as a big fan, having Duke Leto in hand and having him look as good as he does, even with the issues, I'm really happy with what I'm getting. It's not a figure of the year, but it's a piece I would consider to be more middle of the pack currently, which isn't bad. So let me know your thoughts on this one, and as always, thanks for watching, and if you are enjoying the content, please consider dropping a like, comment, or subscribing, and we'll touch base on the next video.